At dawn, the horizon opened like an old wound, bleeding light across the prairie. The oak stood tall in the yard, its bark ridged and ancient, scarred by storms and by men who mistook cruelty for justice. To that tree they tied her, as they had done every morning since her husband was lowered into the ground. Evelyn Harper, widow of 25 years, barren in the eyes of those who measured a woman's worth in children, waited for the ritual of shame to begin. The air was still, but the silence was heavier than wind. Her dress, once a soft tan cotton, now hung faded and frayed, clinging to her frame like it no longer believed in dignity. Her hair fell loose, a dark curtain shielding her face from the eyes of neighbors who gathered at a careful distance. They always came, half ashamed, half hungry for spectacle, their boots sinking into the dust as if the earth itself disapproved of their presence. Some crossed themselves quietly, others whispered words too soft to be heard. None lifted a hand to stop it. From the porch of the weathered cabin, Mason Briggs stepped forward, broad-shouldered and carved by years of labor. He was her brother-in-law, 33, the sort of man whose frown felt like law and whose word was treated like scripture by those too timid to question him. The rope coiled in his hand looked more like an emblem than a tool, the symbol of his authority and her disgrace. His eyes, cold and set deep, never lingered on her face. To him, she was not Evelyn, not a woman with a laugh once bright as river water, but a field gone barren, a vessel that failed. A woman who can't bear fruit, Mason declared, his voice sharp against the morning quiet, is no better than a land gone dry. And land left dry brings nothing but hunger. His words floated across the yard, hard and polished, meant for the crowd more than for her. Evelyn bowed her head, not in agreement but in weary refusal to grant him the satisfaction of her gaze. She had learned that silence could sometimes cut deeper than words. Among the onlookers, an old preacher cleared his throat. His beard was thin, his Bible worn from decades of use. He spoke almost to himself, but the verse carried like a prayer carried by the wind, "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice." A few heads turned, startled by the intrusion of scripture that did not align with punishment. Mason's jaw tightened, yet he said nothing, for even men who claimed authority over women hesitated to quarrel with God outright. Evelyn's wrists burned against the coarse hemp, her skin raw from days of this charade. She thought of her late husband, James, who had once sworn to protect her with the same hands that built this cabin. Death had stolen him in a fevered night, leaving her alone in a house where the walls did not defend. His kin had taken the right to judge her, as though widowhood and emptiness in the womb made her property of their scorn. She wondered if James, wherever he rested, could see the life she had been forced to endure. The morning stretched, each second thick with waiting. Evelyn raised her eyes once, past the oak's branches toward the rising sun. The light fractured through the leaves, painting her face in stripes of gold and shadow. For a fleeting moment, she looked less like a prisoner and more like a saint carved into stained glass, lit from within by endurance. The crowd shifted uneasily, as if the vision accused them. Even children hushed, sensing the gravity their parents tried to ignore. A murmur passed through the watchers when Mason lifted the rope. Evelyn's breath caught, though not from fear of pain she knew well enough to greet like an unwanted guest. What chilled her was the endlessness of it, the knowledge that tomorrow and the day after, the ritual would repeat, until her spirit hollowed or her body failed. The oak would remember every lash, long after the men forgot her name. She closed her eyes and whispered words only she could hear. "If mercy lives anywhere, let it find me soon." Her voice trembled but did not break. It was not a plea, not quite a prayer, but a seed planted in soil that had known drought too long. For an instant, she imagined footsteps not yet taken, a shadow moving where none stood now, someone or something to end the cycle. The thought startled her, as if her own heart had conspired against despair. The crowd leaned forward, breath held in anticipation. Mason's arm hovered, rope poised, the morning sun glinting against the rough fibers. And then, before the strike fell, the silence fractured. Somewhere down the road, faint yet certain, came the sound of wagon wheels, creaking steady as if destiny itself were rolling closer. Heads turned, and dust lifted in the distance, catching light like smoke before a fire. Evelyn's eyes flickered open, and for the first time in many days, she did not look only at the ground. Her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, so slight it might have been mistaken for a shadow. It was not joy, not yet. It was recognition, the sense that something had shifted, unseen but undeniable. The rope had not fallen, the crowd had not dispersed, and her suffering had not ended. Yet the air carried a different weight, a promise as fragile as dawn. Whatever came on that wagon road, it carried more than supplies and dust. It carried the possibility of change. And Evelyn, bound yet unbroken, breathed that possibility into her lungs like it was the first clean air she'd tasted in years. The wagon rattled down the rutted trail, wheels squealing like old bones. Jonah Callahan guided the reins loosely in one hand, the other steadying the small figures tucked beside him. His twin daughters, Mary and Ruth, only 4 years old, leaned against his arms, their braids unraveling in the morning wind. Their dresses, patched and faded, fluttered like small flags of endurance. They were his anchor and his burden both, reminders of love lost and duty unending. Jonah's face, sun-worn and lined beyond his years, was quiet as a stone, yet inside him every mile hummed with the weight of survival. He had not meant to pass through this town. His plan was simple: sell off a pair of cattle, buy flour, salt, and boots for the girls before winter set its teeth. But the crowd near the cabin drew him like an unexpected tide, a gathering too thick for market day, too silent for celebration. He slowed the horses, sensing the tension long before his daughters stirred. Dust rose, catching in the sunlight, and through it he saw her, the figure bound against the oak, hands tied, head bent. The rope lifted in a man's hand, not yet striking but ready, heavy with menace. Mary tugged at his sleeve, her small fingers sticky from a piece of dried apple. "Papa," she whispered, "why is the lady standing like that?" Her voice carried the unguarded clarity of a child who did not yet understand the rules adults invented to justify cruelty. Ruth pressed closer to him, wide eyes fixed on the woman's bowed head. "Is she sick?" she asked. "She looks tired." Jonah did not answer. His throat closed around words he could not shape. He was a man who had buried his wife in the red clay 3 winters ago, a man who had learned to patch dresses, braid hair, and sing lullabies rough as gravel. He knew suffering when he saw it. The woman at the tree was not sick. She was condemned by something harder to cure than illness, the judgment of kin and the silence of neighbors. Jonah's jaw tightened, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. He had no right to intervene, no place in another family's reckoning. Yet his daughter's questions cut sharper than the rope itself. The crowd shifted as the wagon drew nearer, some turning to glance, others too absorbed in the unfolding cruelty to notice. Jonah pulled the reins and stopped just shy of the oak's reach, dust settling over his boots. Evelyn's face lifted slightly, her eyes flicking to the wagon. In that glance there was no plea, no desperate cry for salvation, only a flicker of recognition, as if she had been waiting for something she could not name. Jonah felt the weight of it strike him square, a silent chord strummed between strangers. Mason Briggs, the man holding the rope, scowled at the interruption. "Move along, cowboy," he barked, his voice low with authority. "This ain't your affair." The words hung in the air, sharp as barbed wire. Jonah inclined his head, as though acknowledging the claim. Yet he did not move. His horses stamped impatiently, harnesses jingling, waiting for a command that did not come. Mary, bold as ever, leaned over the side of the wagon. "Papa," she said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "the lady looks sad. Can't we help her?" A hush spread, broken only by the shuffle of boots. Ruth, softer but no less insistent, added, "She needs a blanket, Papa. She's cold." Their innocence cut through the tension like a blade of light through storm clouds. Jonah felt every gaze swing toward him, measuring his response. He kept his eyes fixed on Evelyn, who stood straighter now, her shoulders squaring despite the rope. Something in her silence answered his daughters better than he could. He drew in a slow breath, the leather reins creaking in his hand. He wanted to speak, to name what was wrong here, but words felt heavy in his mouth. Instead he climbed down from the wagon, boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The twins clutched each other, eyes wide, watching their father step forward. Jonah's movements were unhurried, deliberate, like a man measuring each breath against consequence. He stood near enough that Evelyn could see his face clearly, though he did not touch the rope or challenge the crowd outright. His presence alone was a quiet defiance, an unspoken question. What kind of town lets this stand? For a moment, time hung fragile as spun glass. Mason's hand twitched, rope taut, his authority threatened by the weight of a stranger's gaze. The preacher coughed into his hand, murmuring scripture that half the crowd ignored, but Jonah caught the words, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." They echoed in the still air, reverberating in Jonah's chest. His daughters shifted restlessly in the wagon, their trust in him pressing heavier than the rope in Mason's grip. Jonah's voice, when it finally came, was low but steady. He did not address Mason, nor the crowd. He spoke to his girls, though every soul present heard him. "Some things in this world ought not be," he said softly, "and maybe it's left to us to change it." His daughters leaned closer, comforted by the sound of his certainty. Evelyn's eyes, dark and weary, locked with his for a heartbeat longer than strangers should share. Something passed between them, acknowledgment, perhaps, or the faintest spark of hope. The rope did not fall, not yet. The crowd did not disperse, though unease rippled through them like wind across wheat. Jonah stood his ground, a man with nothing more than 2 small children and a weary heart, yet suddenly larger than the shame meant to bind her. And Evelyn, though still tied, felt the first stirrings of change, the sense that dawn might bring more than pain after all. The wagon creaked beneath its own weight, the horses moving slow as if they sensed the burden of what they carried. Evelyn sat in the back, her wrists raw from rope and her spirit thinner than parchment. The twins had insisted she ride, tugging their father's sleeve until he helped her climb up. She tried to protest, whispering that she had no right, no claim on their kindness, but Jonah only shook his head and said in that quiet way of his, "You don't owe me a thing, ma'am. Just sit, breathe, and rest a while." So she did, though her back never left the stiff edge of the wagon and her eyes never strayed far from the horizon. The twins nestled against her, unafraid of the stranger she was. Mary pressed a small bunch of prairie flowers into her hand, petals bent from eager fingers. "These are for you," she said, eyes wide with certainty. Evelyn stared at the fragile blooms, stunned by the offering. She had not been given a gift in years. Ruth leaned her head against Evelyn's arm as though she had known her always. The child's trust was weighty in its innocence. Evelyn's throat tightened, but she said nothing, afraid her voice might betray the tremor building inside. Jonah drove with his usual patience, reins loose, posture steady. He did not fill the air with talk, did not press her for explanations. Silence was his language, and it held her gently, like an unwritten promise. Now and then he glanced back, not at her wounds but at her face, as if measuring whether the road was too much. His eyes were not quick to soften, but they carried a kind of steadiness that steadied her in turn. It unnerved her to feel safer in the company of a stranger than she had ever felt beneath the roof of kin. The land opened wide before them, tall grasses swaying, dust lifting in swirls, sky so blue it seemed like water inverted. Evelyn breathed deep, the air sharp with sage and sun. It smelled like freedom, though she did not dare name it. She thought of James, her late husband, his laugh like river stone clattering, his hand heavy on her shoulder. He had been kind enough, but he was gone, and his family had claimed the right to rule her days. She wondered if he would curse her now for leaving, or if he might bless the wagon that bore her away from shame. Either way, she could not go back. By dusk they reached Jonah's ranch, a modest place tucked against a line of cottonwoods. The house leaned a little, its boards sun-bleached, but smoke rose from the chimney and chickens wandered the yard. It smelled of wood fire and earth, and to Evelyn, who had forgotten what welcome felt like, it seemed almost foreign. Jonah helped her down, careful not to touch more than her elbow. The twins darted ahead, chasing one another across the yard, their laughter ringing like bells that belonged to another life. Evelyn stood still, unsure whether to follow or flee. She had been cast out so many times that the idea of stepping willingly into a home felt dangerous. Jonah cleared his throat, breaking her hesitation. "It's plain," he said, nodding toward the cabin, "but it's shelter. Supper's simple, cornbread and beans. You're welcome if you'll have it." His words carried no demand, no presumption. He spoke as though she had every right to refuse. That, more than the invitation itself, unraveled her defenses. She nodded, following him to the door with cautious steps. Inside, the cabin was small but warm. The table bore scratches from years of use, chairs mismatched, shelves lined with jars of preserves. A lantern cast soft light, brushing warmth against walls that smelled of pine and smoke. Evelyn sank onto a chair, her body grateful even if her pride trembled. The twins clambered into her lap without hesitation, chattering about nothing and everything. How their colt kicked the fence post, how the sky looked like fire at sunset, how beans tasted better with molasses. Evelyn let their words wash over her, the noise filling cracks she had forgotten she carried. When Jonah set a plate before her, steam rising from the beans, her hands shook. She had not eaten a meal prepared without malice in longer than she could measure. She bowed her head, not for prayer but for composure. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonah simply inclined his head, as though thanks were unnecessary. They ate in silence, broken only by the clatter of spoons and the twins' laughter. The simplicity of it pressed against Evelyn's chest until she thought she might weep. It was not feast nor ceremony, but it was kindness, and that was rarer than gold. Later, when the children had curled together on a pallet near the hearth, Jonah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He did not stare at her wounds, though the firelight made them plain. Instead he asked, quietly, "You mean to stay, or you mean to leave come morning?" Evelyn looked at the twins, their small bodies rising and falling in sleep, and felt the weight of choice pressing hard. She wanted to run, to avoid owing anyone anything. Yet her body longed for the chair beneath her, her heart for the laughter that had wrapped her like a quilt. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft as ash. Jonah nodded, as though he had expected nothing else. He did not argue, did not plead. He only said, "Sometimes the best start is not knowing. Let tomorrow decide." His words lingered in the quiet, simple yet disarming. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, staring into the fire. The flames licked upward, restless but steady, a mirror of the turmoil within her. She thought she heard the faintest echo of her own whispered prayer, "If mercy lives anywhere, let it find me soon." For the first time in years, mercy felt near enough to touch. Morning at Jonah's ranch broke softer than Evelyn expected. The air smelled of damp earth, hens clucking in the yard, and the faint sweetness of cornbread left cooling on the table. She woke not to rope or ridicule, but to the sound of children's laughter echoing outside. For a moment she lay still, disoriented, her body braced for shame that did not come. The room held nothing but warmth, quilts folded neatly, boots by the door, sunlight slipping through thin curtains like grace itself. She pressed her palms together, not in prayer but in disbelief, as if testing whether such peace could be real. Jonah moved about the yard with steady rhythm, feeding chickens, checking fences. He was not a man who filled silence with needless words. He nodded to her when she stepped outside, but he did not question her presence or remind her she was free to leave. His restraint unsettled her almost as much as it soothed her. Men had always spoken of what she lacked, what she failed to provide, what she owed. Jonah spoke only when needed, and in his quiet she felt both exposed and strangely safe. The twins, Mary and Ruth, took no notice of her hesitation. They tugged her hands eagerly, begging her to help gather eggs, to chase grasshoppers, to braid their hair. Children, she realized, had no patience for shame. They accepted her as easily as they breathed. Evelyn's heart trembled under the weight of it. She had been told so often she was a barren field, useless, undeserving. Yet here were two little ones pressing wildflowers into her apron pocket, as if declaring she was already theirs. She laughed, a small, startled sound that felt unfamiliar in her own mouth. At supper, Jonah pulled out a chair for her at the rough-hewn table. He did it without ceremony, without looking to see if she noticed. She sat, fingers tracing grooves carved by years of meals, and felt herself slipping into the rhythm of something she had not known since childhood, belonging. The beans were plain, the bread a little coarse, yet she tasted more than food, she tasted reprieve. Afterward, as the twins leaned heavy with sleep against her shoulders, Evelyn whispered, "You trust me with them?" Jonah met her eyes with calm certainty. "They trust you already. That's enough for me." His words settled deep, warm as coals banked for the night. Days unfolded quietly. Evelyn swept the porch, fed hens, Listen to the twins chatter about stars and kittens and dreams. In return she offered stories of her own, small tales her mother once told, long before shame silenced her tongue. The children listened wide-eyed, their laughter stitching seams in the fabric of her heart. When Jonah returned from mending fences, he lingered at the doorway, watching her with the girls, his expression unreadable but not unkind. She felt his gaze like sunlight through clouds, steady, patient, without demand. One evening, as shadows lengthened across the yard, the preacher arrived. His boots were worn, his Bible tucked beneath his arm. He greeted Jonah, then turned to Evelyn with eyes softened by time. "The good book says," he murmured, "He setteth the solitary in families." Evelyn's breath caught, the verse striking deeper than he could know. She lowered her gaze, afraid the preacher might see the longing flicker across her face. Jonah simply nodded, as though the truth had been obvious long before Scripture named it. Later, as twilight deepened and lanterns glowed against the wooden walls, the twins clambered onto Evelyn's lap. Mary yawned, eyelids drooping. "Tell us again about the river," she begged. Ruth, thumb tucked in her mouth, whispered, "Stay here always." Their innocence pressed tears to Evelyn's eyes, hot and unbidden. She kissed the tops of their heads, the words rising before she could stop them. "I never thought anyone would ask." Jonah heard. He did not speak, but his hand paused where it rested on the table, fingers tightening as if the weight of her confession reached him too. That night, after the children slept, Evelyn lingered by the fire. The flames licked the air, restless but steady, a mirror of the turmoil inside her. Jonah sat across the room, mending tack with patient hands. At last he set the leather aside and looked at her fully. "You don't have to answer tonight," he said, voice low, almost hesitant. "But if you mean to stay, the girls would have a mother again. And if you mean to go, no judgment will follow you out that door." His words were simple, but they trembled with possibility. Evelyn stared into the fire, its glow painting her face in shades of gold and shadow. To belong, it was a thought that frightened her more than rope, for it required her to believe she was worthy of love. She thought of the oak tree, of Mason Briggs' voice declaring her a barren field. Then she looked at Mary and Ruth curled on the rug, small breaths steady as a hymn, and she wondered if barren fields might yet bloom when watered by kindness. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the unfamiliar swell of hope there. Jonah did not push for an answer. He only watched her, steady as ever, letting silence do its work. And Evelyn, trembling at the edge of choice, understood that her life had already begun to change, that the question was no longer whether she could belong, but whether she was brave enough to accept it. The knock came at noon, sharp against the wooden door, rattling the quiet that had settled over the ranch. Evelyn froze, her hand still on the flour she had been sifting. The twins looked up from their dolls with wide, unblinking eyes. Jonah set down the saddle he was mending, his jaw tightening, his gaze flicking toward the door like a man who had long expected trouble. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a voice Evelyn knew as well as her own name. Mason Briggs. Her chest tightened, the old fear rising like smoke from a fire thought long extinguished. Jonah rose slowly, wiping his palms on his trousers. He opened the door to find Mason standing tall, hat low, eyes narrowed. Two other men hovered behind him, neighbors Evelyn recognized, though their faces wore unease more than loyalty. Mason's voice was steady, practiced, heavy with entitlement. "She belongs to us," he declared, nodding toward Evelyn. "She's Briggs' blood. Widow or not, she returns with me. This land, this man, none of it changes that." His words were cold law drawn not from books but from the marrow of cruelty. Evelyn stepped forward, though her legs trembled. She wanted to hide, to shrink into shadow, yet something in Jonah's stillness steadied her. Mason's gaze sliced across her, stripping her to the shame he believed defined her. "A barren woman has no place raising children," he spat. "She is wasted soil. Give her back." The twins whimpered and clutched Evelyn's skirt, their small hands like anchors. The room filled with silence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rasp of Jonah's breath. Jonah spoke then, his tone calm but firm, each word shaped like stone set into place. "She belongs where she is wanted. And here, she is wanted. His voice carried no threat, only truth. The preacher's words from days ago seemed to echo in the air. He setteth the solitary in families. Jonah stepped forward, meeting Mason's glare without flinching. You'll not drag her back to chains of shame. Not while I draw breath. His daughters pressed against Evelyn, their trust in him absolute, their wide eyes shining with certainty he would not bend. Mason's lip curled, the rope still dangling from his hand, a relic of the oak tree's cruelty. He raised it slightly, as though memory itself could wound. Yet the crowd outside had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion, and their murmurs rippled like wind across dry grass. They had seen enough mornings of Evelyn's humiliation to feel the weight of their complicity. Now, in the face of Jonah's quiet defiance, some shifted, ashamed. An old woman spoke first, her voice cracked but resolute. She's suffered enough. A man near her nodded, eyes downcast, adding, Let her be. One by one, their silence broke, until even Mason's companions stepped back, unwilling to stand with him against the rising tide of conscience. The moment trembled, balanced on a knife's edge. Jonah's hands remained empty, no weapon drawn, only resolve in his bearing. Evelyn's heart thundered, but for the first time, she felt the crowd not as executioners but as witnesses willing to turn the page. Mason's authority wavered in the shifting air. He sneered, muttered curses under his breath, and at last turned, his boots striking the porch with fury. This ain't over, he growled, but the hollowness in his voice betrayed him. He strode away, the rope dragging in the dust like a snake with its head cut off. His men followed, and the crowd melted slowly, whispers trailing behind them like smoke dissipating in wind. Inside, silence fell again, though it carried a different weight now. Evelyn stood trembling, her hands pressed against her chest. Jonah shut the door, his shoulders sagging as though he had borne the weight of a mountain. The twins clung tighter to Evelyn's skirt, their eyes searching her face for assurance. Evelyn knelt, gathering them into her arms, pressing her cheek against their soft hair. She whispered, voice breaking, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. The words startled her, for they were not a decision she had meant to announce, yet they rang truer than any vow she had spoken before. Jonah crouched nearby, his eyes steady but gentler now. He studied her as if waiting for regret, for retreat, for the shadow of fear to reclaim her. Instead, Evelyn met his gaze with tears glistening in her eyes and a steadiness in her spine she had not known she carried. You gave me shelter, she said softly. But more than that, you gave me back my name. Jonah shook his head, his voice low. You never lost it. Folks just tried to bury it. I only helped you dig it out. His hand brushed against hers where it rested on the twins' shoulders. It was not a claim, not a demand, only an offering, quiet as a prayer. That evening, the table bore cornbread and beans again, nothing more. Yet Evelyn sat at the head beside Jonah, the twins across from them, and the air hummed with something richer than feast. She broke bread with trembling fingers, the simple act carrying the weight of ceremony. She caught Jonah's gaze once, when he thought she wasn't looking, and her heart swelled with something both fierce and fragile. The fire crackled, the children's laughter rose, and Evelyn felt the ground of belonging beneath her feet at last. It wasn't a mansion, or a wedding, or a promise made loud. It was bread on a wooden table, and the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. And maybe that's how homes are made, one small kindness at a time. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.